When my husband Ethan died, I thought losing him would be the hardest thing I'd ever face. But I was wrong. The real heartbreak came after. The betrayal from his own family, the people who stood next to me at his funeral pretending to care. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. Ethan's death was sudden. One moment we were having dinner, talking about his plans to expand his small construction business, and the next he was gone, just like that. The house felt empty without his voice, his laugh, his warmth. I thought his family would be there to help me through it, but they became strangers overnight. His mother, Margaret, stopped calling. His sister, Lydia, barely looked at me at the funeral. When I tried to talk to them, they said things that cut deeper than any wound. Margaret told me I had no real claim to anything Ethan owned, that everything belonged to the family. I was too shocked to respond. I had lived with Ethan for 7 years, married for 4. We had built that home together. A few days after the funeral, I came home to find boxes on the porch. My clothes, my shoes, even Ethan's old jackets, everything packed and dumped outside. The locks had been changed. I stood there, holding the doorknob, realizing I was no longer welcome in my own house. Margaret opened the door, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "It's better this way, dear. You'll move on faster." Then she shut the door in my face. I sat in my car for hours, crying until my throat hurt. It felt like I had lost Ethan twice, once to death, and again to the cruelty of those he left behind. I didn't have much money on hand, so I checked into a cheap motel that smelled like mildew and regret. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's smile, and then Margaret's cold expression replacing it. I didn't understand how everything changed so fast. Just weeks earlier, we'd had Sunday dinners together. Lydia would laugh, Margaret would compliment my cooking. I thought we were a family. Now, it was like I was a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. I tried calling Margaret once more, just to talk things out, but she hung up before I could finish my sentence. Lydia sent me a text that said, "It's time to move on, Ava. Ethan's gone. The family needs space." The words burned. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. But deep down, I knew Ethan wouldn't have wanted this for me. Somewhere in all that pain, a small spark of strength began to form. I didn't know it yet, but that night in that lonely motel room was the start of something they never saw coming. Ethan's funeral was the day everything truly broke inside me. I tried to hold myself together, to stay calm and respectful, but his family made sure I felt like an outsider. Margaret, his mother, refused to let me sit in the front row beside Ethan's casket. She said that space was for family only. I stood there frozen for a few seconds, my hands shaking, before quietly sitting in the second row. People gave me confused looks, and I could hear whispers behind me, but I stayed silent. During the service, I caught Lydia's voice more than once. She leaned toward a few guests and whispered things like, she only married him for his money, and Ethan could have done better. My chest felt tight, but I didn't cause a scene. I just kept my eyes on the floor, waiting for the nightmare to end. When the service was over, Margaret walked past me without a word. She didn't even look at me. Not once did she ask how I was doing or if I needed anything. I watched as she and Lydia stood together, greeting people, acting like I wasn't even there. I felt invisible. That evening, when I finally got home, I wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed and cry. But when I opened the front door, my heart stopped. The hallway was lined with boxes, my boxes. Everything that belonged to me had been packed up and placed by the door. My clothes, the photo frames Ethan and I hung together, even our wedding album. Margaret stood in the living room when I walked in. She crossed her arms and said, "It's better this way. You can take your things and go before this gets messy." I couldn't even speak. My throat went dry. Lydia stood behind her, pretending to look busy on her phone, but I could see the smirk on her face. I tried to reason with them. I told them Ethan and I had built this life together, that this was my home too. Margaret just said, "You have no legal claim to anything here. It's all in Ethan's name. And now that he's gone, it belongs to the family." That night, I packed what I could fit into my car. They didn't even help. Margaret stood by the door as I carried my last box out, and just before I left, she said, "You'll thank me one day." I didn't answer. I just drove away with tears streaming down my face. The next morning, when I returned to pick up a few forgotten things, I couldn't even get in. They had changed the locks. My keys no longer worked. I stood there on the porch, staring at the door that used to open to warmth and laughter, and realized I was now a stranger in my own home. That's when the betrayal truly sank in. The people who were supposed to be my family had turned me out like I was nothing. And as I drove to a cheap motel with everything I owned stuffed in my trunk, I knew one thing for sure. They had no idea who they were dealing with. A week passed, and I was still staying in that small motel room that smelled like old coffee and damp carpet. My mind wouldn't stop replaying everything. The funeral, the boxes, the locked doors. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. I remembered that I still had one of Ethan's old storage boxes in my car trunk. It was something I had grabbed in a hurry when I was packing up that night. I decided to open it. Inside were folders, receipts, and documents that Ethan always said were important. I started going through them one by one. There were bank statements, insurance papers, and mortgage files. My hands shook as I looked at the signatures. Most of them had both our names, mine and Ethan's. But Margaret had told me everything was in Ethan's name, that I had no rights to anything. That was the first time I realized something didn't make sense. I took a closer look at the papers. Our house mortgage document clearly said joint ownership. I saw my name written right under Ethan's signature. I read it again and again just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. My chest tightened with a mix of anger and relief. Margaret had lied. Then I found something that made my heart race, a folder labeled trust account. I didn't remember Ethan ever mentioning it. I opened it and saw that it wasn't connected to our regular bank. It had the name of a place I didn't recognize, First Haven Bank. The document showed both our names again, and next to Ethan's signature was a note that said, "For her if I'm gone." I froze for a moment. My eyes filled with tears as I held that paper. It felt like Ethan was reaching out from beyond, making sure I'd be okay. He had planned something quietly, something he didn't want his family to control. I kept digging through the box, and I found a small envelope with handwritten notes Ethan had made about his finances. He wrote about how his family never respected boundaries, how he wanted to make sure Ava has security if anything happens to me. That line broke me. I whispered his name and cried for a long time. It was like the fog in my head finally started to clear. All this time, I had been believing what Margaret said, that I had nothing. But now, right in front of me, I had proof that Ethan trusted me, that he wanted me protected. I didn't know exactly what that trust meant or how much was in it, but I knew it was something Ethan had left behind just for me. My heart felt a small spark of hope again. I wiped my tears, folded the papers neatly, and put them back in the folder. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept repeating the name First Haven Bank. I decided that in the morning I would go there. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I had to try. Ethan had left me a trail, and for the first time since he died, I had something to hold on to. The next morning, I woke up early and drove straight to First Haven Bank. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel the whole way there. I didn't know what to expect, and part of me was scared I might be wrong. Maybe it was just a small account or something simple. But something deep inside told me Ethan had left me more than just papers. When I walked into the bank, the air felt cold and quiet. I went to the front desk and showed the woman Ethan's trust document. I asked if I could speak to Mr. Coleman, the financial officer whose name was listed on it. She gave me a polite smile and told me to wait. I sat down, staring at my reflection in the glass window, trying to calm my nerves. After a few minutes, a man in his 50s walked out from one of the offices. "Mrs. Turner?" he asked kindly. I nodded and followed him into his office. He closed the door and offered me a seat. I handed him the document and explained everything. How my husband had passed, how his family had thrown me out, and how I found this trust paper among his things. He listened quietly, his face serious but kind. Then he took the papers from me and checked them carefully. "Do you have identification and your marriage certificate?" he asked. I handed them to him with shaky hands. He looked at them, typed something into his computer, and then paused. For a moment, he didn't say anything. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. Finally, he looked up and said softly, "Mrs. Turner, your husband set up a secondary trust account under both your names. It's valid and active." I didn't understand at first. "What does that mean?" I asked. He smiled a little and said, "It means this account belongs to both of you, and since he's passed, it's legally yours now. And," he hesitated, pulling up another file on his screen, "it seems your husband kept this separate from his family. They don't even know it exists." Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened. He continued, The trust contains his private savings, business profits, and some long-term investments. It's not a small amount, Mrs. Turner. He made sure you would be taken care of. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. Your husband left this here with specific instructions. It's addressed to you. My hands trembled as I took it. I opened it slowly, and inside was a single piece of paper with Ethan's handwriting. If anything happens to me, this money is for her. Not them. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The words blurred through my tears. Ethan had known exactly what might happen. He knew his family too well, and he made sure I'd be safe even when he couldn't protect me himself. Mr. Coleman gave me time to compose myself, then walked me through the next steps. By the time I left that office, my heart felt different, still broken but stronger. For the first time since Ethan's death, I didn't feel powerless. I had proof of his love and trust. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of something they never expected. When I left the bank that day, I sat in my car for a long time just holding Ethan's letter. The paper shook in my hands, but my heart felt steady for the first time in weeks. It was like he was still with me, guiding me, making sure I'd be okay. I could almost hear his voice telling me not to let them win. For the first time since he passed, I didn't feel lost. I felt protected. Mr. Coleman had helped me transfer everything legally into my own account. He explained every step carefully and made sure I understood it all. When the final signature was done, he looked at me and said, "Ethan planned this carefully. He wanted you to have control." Those words meant more to me than he knew. I thanked him, holding back tears, and promised myself I'd use the money wisely. When I got back to the motel, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I looked around the small, dim room that had become my temporary home and thought, I don't belong here. I had enough now to start over, maybe even buy a new place, but I wasn't ready yet. I wanted time to think. For a few days, I stayed quiet. I didn't contact anyone. I just went for walks, ate simple meals, and tried to find peace. I thought maybe I could let it all go. The insults, the humiliation, being thrown out of my home. Maybe I could just walk away and start again somewhere else. But peace didn't last long. One afternoon, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw Lydia's name, but curiosity got the better of me. The moment I said hello, she started talking like nothing had ever happened. "Hey, Ava," she said, her voice light and cheerful. "Just wanted to let you know we redecorated the house. It looks so much better now. You wouldn't even recognize it." I went completely silent. She laughed softly, like she was proud of herself. "Oh, and we finally got rid of that old furniture you liked so much. It was so outdated." Something inside me broke in that moment. My throat burned, and I could feel my hands shaking, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was anger. The kind that builds slowly until it can't be ignored anymore. I didn't yell. I didn't give her the satisfaction of hearing me cry. I just said, "Enjoy it while you can," and hung up. After that call, I sat quietly for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Ethan's letter was still in my purse. I took it out and read it again. This money is for her. Not them. The meaning hit me deeper this time. Ethan hadn't just wanted to protect me. He'd trusted me to stand up for myself. That night, as I stared out the motel window, I made a promise to him and to myself. I wouldn't let them erase everything we built. They thought I was weak, that I'd just disappear. But I wasn't going anywhere. After that call from Lydia, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying her words over and over in my head. How easily she laughed about redecorating the house Ethan and I built together. At first, I wanted to storm over there, to shout and demand what was mine. But then I remembered Ethan's letter. He wanted me to be strong, not reckless. That's when I decided I needed to be smart. The next morning, I searched for an attorney who specialized in estates and property law. I found a quiet, older man named Mr. Jensen whose office was just a few miles away. When I met him, I told him everything, from Ethan's death to being thrown out, to discovering the trust and the documents with my name on them. He listened carefully, nodding without interrupting, then asked to see the paperwork. I handed him the files I had gathered, the mortgage agreement, the trust documents, and Ethan's handwritten note. He looked through each one slowly, making small notes on a pad. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Ava, everything here shows that you're not just entitled to part of the estate. Half of it legally belongs to you." I was speechless for a moment. "You mean the house?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "Yes. The mortgage lists both your names. They had no right to change the locks or remove you from the property. And since Ethan didn't leave a will transferring ownership, your share automatically passes to you as his spouse. They've been living in your property without legal permission. Hearing that filled me with a calm kind of strength. It wasn't anger anymore, it was clarity. I told him I didn't want drama or confrontation. I just wanted what was rightfully mine. He smiled and said, "Then we'll do this quietly." Over the next few days, Mr. Jensen filed a motion to freeze the property's title and secure Ethan's estate accounts. He explained that this would stop anyone from selling, transferring, or using the property until the court reviewed ownership. He also arranged for notices to be sent to Margaret and Lydia through their attorney. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. I just waited. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Mr. Jensen. "They've been served," he said simply. Later that evening, I imagined the scene in that house. Margaret opening the letter from the court, her hands probably trembling, Lydia standing behind her confused and scared. They must have realized in that moment that everything they thought they'd taken from me was slipping through their fingers. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about fairness, about restoring what was mine. Ethan had built that home with love, and I wasn't going to let them erase me from it. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. I knew the fight wasn't over yet, but now it was being fought on my terms, with proof and law on my side. The quiet part of me, the one they thought was weak, was just beginning to show her strength. It was time they learned who they had really underestimated. A few days after the court notices were sent, Mr. Jensen called to tell me that Margaret had requested a meeting. He said she was furious and wanted to clear things up. I could already imagine how that conversation would go, but I agreed to be there. I wanted to face them and finally hear what they had to say when the truth was in front of them. When I arrived at Mr. Jensen's office, Margaret and Lydia were already there. Margaret was pacing the room, her face red with anger. Lydia sat quietly in a chair, looking smaller than usual, her confidence gone. The moment I walked in, Margaret turned toward me and snapped, "How dare you do this to us?" I didn't answer. I just took a seat beside my lawyer. Mr. Jensen remained calm as he opened a folder filled with documents. He placed them neatly on the table, the trust deed, the mortgage papers, and copies of Ethan's signed instructions. Margaret's eyes darted from one paper to the next, but she didn't say anything. "You manipulated my son," she finally said, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You made him sign things he didn't understand. This isn't right." Mr. Jensen didn't even flinch. He looked at her calmly and said, "Mrs. Turner, your late son was very clear about his intentions. These documents were verified by the bank, the state registrar, and witnesses. Ethan's signatures match perfectly across every form. Nothing was forged, nothing was forced." Margaret tried to speak again, but her voice cracked. Lydia looked down at her hands, her face pale. She whispered, "Mom, maybe we should stop." But Margaret ignored her. Mr. Jensen continued, "Everything you've claimed belongs to the estate, and half of it legally belongs to Ava. Ethan made it very clear who he trusted and who he wanted to protect. He turned one of the documents around so they could see Ethan's handwritten note, the same one I had held at the bank." The room went silent. Margaret's face went from red to white. She looked completely defeated, like all the fight had drained out of her. Lydia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, eyes glistening with tears she tried to hide. After a long pause, Margaret finally stood up. "He would never have done this to his own family," she muttered, her voice breaking. "You've turned him against us, even in death." I wanted to shout back, to remind her of everything they did, how they locked me out, how they laughed about redecorating. But I didn't. I just looked at her and said quietly, "Ethan made his choice, and he chose to protect me." Mr. Jensen gathered the papers and said in his firm, professional tone, "There's nothing more to discuss. The court recognizes Ava's ownership. The property and funds will remain frozen until everything is transferred properly." Margaret stared at me one last time before turning toward the door. Lydia followed behind her, silent. As they walked out, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or seek revenge. The truth had done it for me. When the door closed, Mr. Jensen looked at me and smiled faintly. "Justice doesn't always make noise," he said. I nodded. He was right. I didn't win. Weeks later, the court ruling finally came through. Mr. Jensen called to tell me the judge had granted full possession of the house to me. I listened quietly as he read the order, my heart steady but heavy. After everything, I wasn't celebrating. I just felt ready to take back what was mine. A few days later, I drove to the house. It looked the same as when they locked me out, except the garden had gone wild and the curtains were drawn tight. For a moment, I stood on the sidewalk and took a deep breath. This was the place Ethan and I had built together, the home that carried both laughter and pain. When I walked up the path, I saw Margaret and Lydia sitting on the front steps with boxes around them. Their faces were drawn, tired, and full of bitterness. Margaret looked up when she saw me. "Ava," she started, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Please, we have nowhere else to go. Just give us some time." I remembered that night, standing outside in the rain, my clothes thrown into garbage bags, their laughter echoing from inside as I knocked on the locked door. I remembered the humiliation, the cold, the disbelief that they could be that cruel. So I looked at them now, not with hate, but with the calmness that comes when you no longer need revenge. "Now you know how it feels," I said simply. Margaret's eyes filled with tears and Lydia turned away, pretending to organize her things. I didn't say anything more. I didn't raise my voice or linger. The court order had given them 10 days to leave, and that time had passed. The movers they had hired were finishing up, loading the last boxes into a van parked by the curb. I stepped past them and unlocked the front door. The familiar sound of the key turning hit me harder than I expected. The house was quiet, but it smelled the same, a mix of old wood and the faint scent of lavender from the candles I used to light. Inside, everything looked different. The furniture was rearranged, some of my things were missing, and the walls had been repainted. But it didn't matter. This was still my home, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I walked through each room slowly. The living room where Ethan used to read, the kitchen where we cooked together, the small office where we planned our future. I ran my hand over the walls, not to remember the pain, but to reclaim my peace. Outside, I could hear the sound of the van driving away. I didn't look through the window. I just stood in the middle of the living room, closed my eyes, and listened to the silence. When I finally walked to the door, I looked once more at the empty street, then closed it gently behind me. No shouting, no gloating, no audience, just a quiet ending to a cruel chapter. I was home again. By fighting, I won by standing still and letting the truth speak. A few days after I moved back into the house, I started cleaning Ethan's old study. The room had been left untouched since the day he passed. Dust covered the bookshelves, and the faint smell of his cologne still lingered in the air. Every corner of that room carried a memory, his laughter, his late nights working, the quiet moments when we'd sit together and talk about everything and nothing. As I began sorting through the drawers of his desk, I found some old receipts, notebooks, and faded photographs. Then, in the very back of the bottom drawer, I noticed something wedged between two stacks of papers, a sealed envelope. It was slightly yellowed, but my name was written on it in Ethan's familiar handwriting. My heart stopped for a moment. I sat down and stared at it, afraid to open it. My hands were shaking as I finally broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter, written in his neat, careful style. The first line made my breath catch. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. I know my family too well, but I trust you'll fight for yourself. This house, this life, it's all yours. Don't let them break you." I read it again and again, tears falling onto the page. His words felt alive, like he was sitting across from me, speaking softly the way he used to. He had known what would happen. He had seen the greed in his family long before I ever did, and he had tried to protect me in the only way he could, by preparing everything. The trust, the documents, the account at the bank, none of it had been coincidence. He had planned it all, step by step, making sure I'd have the strength and proof I needed to stand my ground. Every action I had taken since his death, finding the papers, meeting Mr. Coleman, hiring the lawyer, it was exactly what he wanted me to do. I could almost hear his voice saying, "You'll be fine, Ava. You're stronger than you think." For a long while, I just sat there, holding the letter close. The anger, pain, and loneliness that had followed me for months began to soften. Instead of bitterness, I felt gratitude. Ethan might have been gone, but in every way that mattered, he was still guiding me. I placed the letter back in its envelope and put it in a small box with our wedding photo. Then I closed the drawer gently. The study didn't feel empty anymore. It felt warm, like Ethan's presence was still there, watching over me. That night, I lit a candle on his desk and whispered a quiet thank you. I finally understood that I hadn't been fighting alone. Every move, every decision, had been part of his silent plan to keep me safe. And now, with his words in my heart, months passed and slowly, the house began to feel like mine again. The anger that once filled the air was gone, replaced by calm and light. I started making small changes, repainting the walls, fixing the porch Ethan had built, and clearing out the things that reminded me of the pain. I didn't do it to erase the past. I did it to start fresh, to give the place new life. The rooms that once echoed with arguments and cold silence began to feel warm again. I added soft colors, new curtains, and framed pictures of Ethan and me, moments when we were happy and free. The more I worked, the more the house transformed, just like I was. It was no longer a place of grief or betrayal. It became a home again, my home. Outside, I planted roses by the porch, the kind Ethan used to bring me every Sunday. As I watered them one morning, I realized how far I had come. There was a time when I thought I'd lost everything, my husband, my home, my sense of belonging. But now, standing there under the sunlight, I knew I hadn't lost. I had rebuilt. Margaret and Lydia were gone from my life completely. I never heard from them again after the court's decision. Sometimes people in town would mention seeing them struggle to find a new place, but I didn't feel joy or pity, just peace. I didn't need to see them pay. Life had already done that in its own way. When people asked me how I managed to survive everything, being kicked out, betrayed, and left alone, I simply smiled and said, sometimes the best revenge is letting the truth do the talking. Because it was true. I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't fight with words or hate. I just let justice take its course. And in the end, the truth stood taller than any lie they told. Every evening, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sun go down. I'd think about Ethan, how much he had loved this house, how much effort he had put into making it ours. And though I missed him deeply, I could finally feel the peace he wanted from me. The nights no longer felt heavy. The silence no longer hurt. The pain had turned into quiet strength. I realized revenge doesn't always have to be loud or cruel. Sometimes it's just reclaiming what's yours and moving on without looking back. As the roses bloomed, I felt like Ethan was there with me, watching, proud that I had kept my head high and my heart steady. I had walked through betrayal, grief, and loneliness, and come out standing. I didn't win by breaking others down. I won by rising, rebuilding, and finding peace again. And that, I knew, was exactly what Ethan had wanted all along. I felt ready to move forward, not in sorrow, but in peace.